All right, strap in, because today we're diving headfirst into the critical world of military assessment, and we're going deep with ADP 50, Chapter 5. I know, another Army manual. But trust me, this is like having a superpower on the battlefield if you can really wrap your head around it.
Yeah, I like that. Think about it like upgrading your strategic decision making, no matter if you're running a small squad or a huge operation.
Okay, you've got my attention. So ADP 50, Chapter 5, it's all about assessment. But what does that even mean in the big picture? Like, is it just a fancy way to say evaluation?
Not exactly, no. It's bigger than just deciding if something is good or bad. Assessment is more about like taking your operational pulse, making sure that you're on track and that you're going to achieve your objectives.
Okay, so it's less about the what and more about understanding the why behind what's happening and using that to drive decisions.
You got it. It's like this constant loop, right? You're always gathering information and then you're analyzing it and then you're adapting your approach based on what you learn. You're staying agile and making sure every move, every decision really counts.
Okay, I like it. So is assessment the same whether you're leading a small squad or a massive operation?
At its core, yeah. The core principles, they're definitely the same. But the scale, how formal it is, yeah, that definitely changes. If you're talking about, squad leaders out there, you're focused on your team's readiness personnel, equipment, are your boots on the ground ready to execute the mission? It's practical, hands-on.
Yeah, got to make sure those on the front lines are good to go.
Yeah.
But what about when we zoom out? You know, we're talking about a larger operation. Does it still apply?
Absolutely. As you move up, brigade, division, even the core level, it becomes a lot more structured. You've
Yeah.
got dedicated staff, analysts, maybe even entire teams who are just crunching numbers and data all day. Think spreadsheets, predictive models, the whole nine yards.
So no matter what, whether it's, a clipboard or a computer screen, the heart of assessment stays consistent.
Exactly. And there are three core activities within assessment that apply no matter what your role is: monitoring, evaluating, and recommending or directing action based on what you learn.
Okay, I like it. A three-pronged approach for staying ahead of the game. So let's break those activities down. First up, monitoring. What does that entail?
Monitoring is your intel gathering phase. It's all about constantly observing and collecting information. Could be enemy activity, the terrain, even something as specific as like how the civilians are feeling. All of that helps paint a picture.
So it's about maintaining that constant awareness of everything that's happening around you.
Yes. But just having the raw data, that doesn't tell the whole story. That's where the evaluating comes in. You have to be able to separate the noise from what's actually important.
And that's where we bring in those measures of performance, or MOPs,
Yeah.
and the measures of effectiveness, or MOEs.
Bingo. And yeah, no, all the acronyms can sometimes feel like a completely different language, but these are really important. To help us understand how these work, let's dive into a real-world example. Operation Support Hope in Rwanda.
Now, there's a mission with some serious weight behind it. All right, I'm ready. Break it down for me. How did they use MOPs and MOEs in that situation?
Okay, so their initial objective, they needed to bring down the death rate in those refugee camps. Things were really bad. They had to get it under control. So one of their MOEs actually measured whether that death rate fell to a level that, the UN considered to be normal for camp operations. We're literally talking about measuring lives saved. And they also had this goal of opening up the Kigali airfield so it could operate 24/7. So one MOE they used for that was tracking how much airfield use increased and how much cargo they could move through there.
That's incredible. By setting these clear MOEs that tied back to their objectives, they could actually tell if what they were doing was making an actual impact. It's all about measuring the impact.
Right. Now think of MOPs as more about measuring the tasks themselves. So you've got this task. Did it get done? Was it done on time? Was it done to standard? It's making sure that all the gears of the mission are turning and things are moving.
Okay, so MOEs measure that overall effectiveness, how we're doing toward the bigger goal, and MOPs are tracking all the individual tasks to help us get there.
Got it.
Hmm.
So we've gathered all this information, we've analyzed it. What's the final piece of the puzzle?
And this is where it gets really interesting. The last part is recommending or directing action based on everything you just learned. Because, what good is all this assessment if you don't actually do anything with it, right? It's like, planning this whole road trip, but then you just never leave your driveway.
Right, you've got to actually use the intel you're gathering to course correct when you need to. It's like if you're on that road trip and you hit like a massive traffic jam, you're
Yeah.
not just going to, keep going. Exactly. You're going to reassess, check the map, find a detour, right? That's what this is all about. We figure out Do we need to stay the course, or do we need to make some adjustments? And sometimes that means, yeah, shifting resources, adjusting the timelines, maybe even completely changing how we're approaching the whole thing.
So how does this work in practice, though? Does ADP 5.0, give us a framework to put this all into action?
It absolutely does. ADP 5.0, it lays out this like really clear six-step process that you can take and use right now to put these principles to work.
All right, you've got my attention. Let's break it down step by step.
Okay, so step one, you're developing your assessment approach, and you're doing this way back in the planning phase. You're deciding what information do you actually need and where are you going to get it. Then step two, you're building out that detailed assessment plan. And this is where you're linking your MOEs, your MOPs to those specific tasks, those objectives.
So it sounds like the first two steps are really about laying the groundwork for an effective assessment, making sure that everyone's on the same page from, the very beginning.
Yep, exactly. Steps 3 and 4 bring us into the actual operational phase. So we're collecting information throughout the mission and then analyzing it. This is where those regular meetings, those reports, the intel you're getting from all these different sources, it all comes together.
Okay, so we've planned, we've gathered our information, we've analyzed it. What's next?
Step 5. We come back to recommending or directing action. This is where you present your findings, your recommendations to the people who are actually making those decisions. But remember, it's not just about what you say, it's about how you say it, especially when you're talking to higher-ups.
Right. Knowing your audience is critical no matter what the situation is. Okay, so that brings us to the last step. What happens after those recommendations are out there?
All right, so step 6 is where the commander really steps in. They take your recommendations, combine it with their Rune assessment, and then they make the final call. Do we adjust the plan, or do we stay on course?
It's a team effort, even at the highest level. Commanders rely on getting those accurate, timely assessments so they can make those critical decisions. So it sounds like ADP 5.0 gives us a pretty solid roadmap to follow as we go through this whole assessment process. But are there any additional tips, best practices that can help us make sure that we're really getting it right?
Absolutely, and this is where experience really comes in. One of the most important things that ADP 5.0 emphasizes is commander involvement. And this is key. This is not just a staff exercise. Commanders, they need to be directly involved in this whole assessment process.
That makes sense. I mean, it's their vision, their mission, right? They need to be in the loop.
Exactly, and ADP 5.0 really stresses that commanders should be setting those assessment priorities. They should be guiding what the staff is focused on, asking those really insightful questions. Are we focused on the things that really matter here? They need to cut through all the noise and get to the heart of the issue.
Right, so efficiency is important. It's not about just measuring everything just because we can measure it. We need to really focus on what's going to help us make the best decision.
Exactly, and that actually leads us to another really important point. Integration. Assessment. This isn't a solo mission. This is a team effort. Every single section, intel, logistics, operations, they all have their own unique piece, their own perspective to contribute, but it's got to be coordinated or else it's not going to work.
Right, it's like, each section is a piece of a puzzle. You need all of them to actually see the complete picture.
Exactly, and that is where the assessment working group comes in. Their job is to bring everyone to the table, share those insights, avoid duplicating effort, and then develop those really comprehensive assessments that go up to the commander.
So this working group, are they meeting, regularly throughout the operation, make sure everyone's on the same page?
Yeah. And how often they meet, that really depends. It depends on what the situation is, because things can change fast, especially in a dynamic environment. And if something urgent comes up, they don't wait for a meeting. They get that information up to the commander immediately.
Act decisively. But you always want to make sure that you are acting with, the best information possible.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got commander involvement. We've got the importance of integrating all these different perspectives. What else should we be keeping in mind as we're going through this process?
Okay, this next one is big. You absolutely have to understand the why behind the plan. Don't just focus on the what and the how. Really try to grasp the reasoning, the logic behind every single decision.
So we're going deeper than just the surface level here, right?
Yeah.
We want to understand the strategic context that's really driving the mission itself.
Yes. Why did we choose to do it this way? What assumptions are we making? By understanding that why, it lets us choose the MOEs and the MOPs that are actually relevant. It makes sure that we're measuring the stuff that truly matters. It's about aligning our assessment with the big picture.
I see how understanding that why ties back to everything that we've talked about so far. Okay, so are there any other pitfalls we should, like, watch out for, things to avoid?
One thing to be really careful of is jumping to conclusions, especially when it comes to cause and effect. Just because two things happen around the same time doesn't mean that one of them actually caused the other one.
Right. Just because you see a correlation doesn't necessarily mean there's causation there. Can you give us an example of how this might play out in, a military context?
I mean, sometimes it's obvious. You fire a missile, something explodes.
Yeah.
Easy, right? But other times, especially when you're dealing with, how people behave, these really complex systems, those links, much harder to pin down.
And I imagine it's even more challenging in the middle of a battlefield that's constantly changing, and there's just so many different things happening all at once.
Exactly. And ADP 50 is really good about making this point very clear. It is hard to figure out, did what we do actually lead to that outcome? It can be really, really difficult. But we have to try because it is so essential for effective assessment. We've got to be honest with ourselves about what we can and can't conclude based on what we know.
So don't jump to conclusions, stay flexible, and always be ready to adjust your approach as new information comes in. That's really great advice. To really illustrate just how critical these principles can be, ADP 50 actually uses this really compelling example from Operation Iraqi Freedom, and it shows how one commander's commitment to assessment led to this really pivotal decision that really changed the course of the whole campaign.
It's a great story, and it's the perfect example of how powerful assessment can be.
All right, I love a good story. So set the scene for us. What happened?
Okay, so it's March 2003. We're 8 days into the invasion of Iraq. And coalition forces, under the command of General David McKiernan, they're on the edge of Baghdad.
Okay, so the pressure is on. The whole world is watching. What's the situation like on the ground?
So V Corps, this massive army unit, is pushing north up the west side of the Euphrates River. And at the same time, the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, another huge force, they're pushing east. And along the way, they're dealing with everything. Sandstorms, enemy resistance, and just logistical nightmares.
Yeah, talk about a high-pressure situation.
It definitely was. And General McKiernan, he wanted to get a feel for the situation from his commanders on the ground, General Conway and General Wallace. He wanted to hear straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
There's nothing like getting that firsthand intel from the people who are actually out there on the front lines. So what was the consensus? Were they ready to make a move on Baghdad?
So both of the commanders, they were confident in their troops, but they also had some concerns. General Wallace, he was leading those army forces, and he wanted to take a little bit of time to reposition his troops before they launched an all-out assault on Baghdad. He wanted to make sure that they were in the best possible posture to succeed.
So he was advocating for a more cautious approach, making sure they were completely set up for success before they made that final push. What about the Marines? What was their take?
General Conway was facing really, really heavy fighting around this city called Nasiriyah. They needed more support, especially air power, to help soften up those enemy defenses before they made a move on Baghdad. They were in a tough spot.
So two different perspectives, but both of them were informed by, the realities on the ground. So what did McKiernan do? What was the decision?
McKiernan listened to his commanders, considered their assessments, and made a really gutsy call. He decided to pause the advance on Baghdad for a few days.
Wow, that's a big decision to make, especially with the entire world watching. What was the reasoning there? Why hit pause?
You see, McKiernan, he realized that if they just rushed into Baghdad without fully consolidating all the gains they'd already made, without really addressing those concerns that his commanders had brought up, it would have put his forces at a much bigger risk than he was comfortable with. He realized that by taking a little pause, even though it was unexpected, could actually lead to a more decisive victory down the road.
So it's about choosing the path that makes the most strategic sense, even if it's not necessarily the fastest one.
Exactly. And it just goes to show how important continuous assessment is. Even when you've got what you think is a solid plan, things change, new information is going to come up, and you've got to be ready and willing to adapt.
Because as they say, no plan survives contact with the enemy, or in this case, the complexities of war.
You got it. And this applies no matter what your role is, whether you're leading a small squad or you're in charge of this massive, complex operation.
Okay, so we have covered a ton of information today. We defined assessment, broke down that 6-step process, and talked about how these principles have played out in the real world.
Yeah.
So as we start to wrap up, what are some key takeaways you want our listeners to walk away with today?
I think the big one is that assessment. It's not just a one and done kind of thing. This is an ongoing process that we should be using in every single phase of the mission.
Right, it's about staying vigilant, staying informed, and staying adaptable.
You got it. The second thing, assessment is a team sport, right? It takes input and coordination from every level, from the top to the bottom.
And lastly, never underestimate how important it is to understand the why. Don't just go through the motions here. Take the time to understand that strategic context behind the mission and then use that to inform your assessments.
All great points. And if you can really take those principles to heart and put them into practice, you're well on your way to becoming a better leader and a more effective decision maker.
Yeah, when you see it play out like that, it really hits home, you know?
Right. It's like that's how it all comes together. Assessment, it bridges that gap between, the theory and actually putting it into practice. It's about taking all these big ideas from, the manual and actually turning them into like concrete actions that make a real difference.
And it's clear, like, based on that example from Operation Iraqi Freedom, that those actions, they can have huge implications. We're talking like strategic level implications on a campaign.
And I think it's a good reminder, too,
Yeah.
even when you're in the thick of it and everything's moving a mile a minute and changing constantly, sometimes you've got to just take a breath, assess where you're at, and then adapt.
Because sometimes the smartest path forward isn't just about speed.
100%. So, as we wrap up our deep dive here into ADP 50's Chapter 5, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to remember?
If I had to pick one thing, it's that assessment. It's not just another box to check on a to-do list. It's really more of a mindset, this constant process of trying to understand what's going on and then using that understanding to make the best decisions that you possibly can.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So next time you're planning out a mission, whether it's, for a training exercise or you're getting ready for a real-world deployment, think back to what we talked about today.
Ask yourself, okay, how can I use these principles, these ideas of monitoring, evaluating, and taking action? How can I apply that to what I do?
Because when it comes down to effective assessment, that might be the difference between mission success and mission failure.
Stay vigilant, stay informed, and as always, thanks for joining us.